This week in our study of the book of Acts, we turn to the epicenter where the entire narrative begins, where all of the action starts. And that is with the birth of the very first church in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost. But I guarantee you, there's more here than initially meets the eye. You've probably read the story before. It begins in chapter 2, verse 1, by telling us that when the day of Pentecost came, they, the disciples, were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit enabled them. Skipping to verse 13, it says, some, however, made fun of them and said they had too much wine. So quite a scene is being made by this phenomenon of the infilling of the Holy Spirit in Acts 2. But I want you to pay attention to what surprisingly happens as Luke slows down in between the event of the day of Pentecost and the response of some of the crowd that these folks are just drunk. Look what happens. Verse 5. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one of them heard him speaking in his own language. So we're specifically referring here to earthly human languages. Verse 7, utterly amazed they asked, are not all these men who are speaking Galileans? That's like saying, are they not just uneducated, illiterate folks from Galilee? Verse 8, then how is it that each one of us hears them in his own native language? Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongue. Now my point is, Luke slows down here because he wants you to think about these individual nations. It's fascinating because he's already told us in verse 5 that God-fearing Jews are there as pilgrims for the Pentecost festival from every nation under heaven. We already know that. And then he slows down. He creates space to have us think about a map. He wants us, in our context, I suppose, to think about a globe and to think about these different peoples speaking these different languages whose language has now been united by the wonders of God. What could this be about? Well, I want to suggest to you that this text is reflecting and refracting a very specific text in the Old Testament. Luke is a student of the Old Testament. Luke knows the Old Testament, and I believe in Acts chapter 2, he is specifically addressing an ancient text way back in Genesis chapter 11, a text that you may have heard about, typically referred to as the Tower of Babel. I want to push back against that because the point of the story in Genesis 11 is that it's not a Tower of Babel, it's a city of Babel. What happens in chapter 11 verse 1, it says, now the whole world had one language and a common speech, meant to promote the unity of mankind. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. Wow. If you've read Genesis before, you know that the people of God in Genesis, they don't settle. They're nomads. They have to leave their home and stay on the move. So for the first time here, a group of people find a valley, a plain that has irrigation and where the ground is fertile, and they decide to stop. We're going to settle. Verse 3. They said to each other, come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly. Let's use brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city. So these are the first propagants of technology in the Genesis story. They're using different brick technology that can build greater and greater buildings. So they say, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, with a skyscraper, so that we may make a name for themselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. And the Lord was not impressed by this. Now, part of the edge to this story is that God in the Old Testament does not seem to like cities very much. God, especially in Genesis, his people are a rural people. God knows that cities are where power is consolidated, where empires are built that can rule over regions of people, as exactly the case here, and the intention of the characters in Genesis chapter 11. And God says in verse 6, if one people speaking the same language have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their languages so that they will not understand each other. So, languages in the Genesis story in chapter 11 become a means of preventing human groups from oppressing one another. You have one group with one language that's basically going to rule as an empire over a region, and God says, "No, we're going to institute different languages so that that's a lot harder to do." This was part of God's rescue mission in Genesis to produce these different languages, but we know that that rescue mission did not last very long because of human will. People took their languages, got with folks who spoke their languages, and created various nation states and empires that could oppress one another and brutalize one another and fight against one another. So the project of languages to keep people from oppressing one another becomes a failure as mankind, once again, just as he did in the garden, takes things over for himself. What happens in Acts chapter 2? Well, in Genesis 11, the varying languages that people speak create dissension, create factions, and eventually create empires and oppression. But in Acts chapter 2, all of these languages do the opposite. The day of Pentecost is a radical reversal of what we see happening in the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. Those languages that were once there that confused the people of the earth, now in Acts 2, unite people from every nation. As they hear unity in diversity, they hear all of these languages being spoken, but yet amidst all these languages they hear one message, and that message is the message of the wonders of God being proclaimed in their tongues. I hope this week, as we begin our study of Acts 2 and beyond, that you will see the majesty in this text, and that you will claim for yourself the great prophecy from Joel that Peter cites. Even on my sons and my daughters I will pour out my spirit, says God. That's what's going on in Acts 2, and it breaks boundaries that the world had not seen broken in thousands of years.